Welcome to Canadian Affairs. I am Sam Forster, and today I will be speaking with Mr. Tristin Hopper. Mr. Hopper is one of the more lively figures in Canadian journalism. He is a reporter and columnist at the National Post. He is also the author of Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Mr. Hopper, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You have recently written a very interesting, very castigatory book titled Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Very quickly, I will read the book's description. Drawing from real headlines, deep research, and extensive interviews, acclaimed journalist Tristin Hopper uncovers the bizarre missteps and policy experiments that have helped Canada set new global standards for dysfunction. The examples are legion: the real estate bubble that never bursts, Orwellian internet regulations, harm reduction policies that escalate harm, official health guidelines that recommend the use of glory holes in a pandemic, and a runaway euthanasia system that inspired the Wall Street Journal to declare, "Welcome to Canada, the doctor will kill you now." As sobering as it is comic, Don't Be Canada examines the cascading consequences of extreme policies and tells the tragic story of a country that took its wealth, tolerance, and functionality for granted. Now, as that description says, the book examines quite a wide range of problems and policy areas that may seem to outside observers as unrelated. How did you arrive at this list of issues? Is there a unifying quality that characterizes them? Is it simply the case that they're all
Oh,
impact?
it only got a chapter if it was something that Canada was doing uniquely bad or on which we were an outlier. So we were doing something that no one else in the world was doing. So there's no chapter on like debt accumulation, federal debt accumulation. There's no chapter on like poor military readiness because that's something we're not doing great on either of those categories, but the rest of the Western world is also not doing particularly well. So it only qualified as a chapter if I was able to show that there was something we were doing that was beyond the pale for any of our peer countries. So if you're sitting in, one of the countries we usually get compared to, so the Netherlands, Belgium, any of the Scandinavian countries, you're still looking at Canada and on this specific issue saying, oh, that's something well beyond what we have. And that's in terms of policy or performance. A great example would be, you mentioned our MAID system. Canada is, first of all, we have the fastest growing assisted suicide system of anywhere on Earth. For the first few years of it, it was an increase of 30% per year, year after year after year, way beyond what we thought it was going to be. We thought it was going to comprise 2% of deaths. After 10 years, maybe it would level out at 2% of total Canadian deaths. And it blew past 4% within like 3 years. So there's way more MAID deaths happening than anybody anticipated. And what makes the Canadian system unique, and the reason I wrote this book is I'm sure most Canadians aren't aware of this. They're not aware of a lot in the book, I think, is that the Canadian MAID system is different from any other assisted suicide system around the world in that it is within medical guidelines. It is considered necessary to inform patients of their option for assisted suicide. So doctors and nurses are told, if you have someone with a chronic condition, it is your job to tell them that death is an option. You shouldn't assume that they just know about this already. It is within your clinical care guidelines. You should tell them, by the way, you could get treatment or you could die. This is illegal in places like Australia or New Zealand. So you have something which is, considered illegal in a peer country, and here it's actually recommended. And there's just any number of those things throughout the book. Some weird policy twist that I'm sure as Canadians we assume is followed across the Western world, but is very much unique to us.
Right. Of the various social and political trends you focused on in the book, does one stand out as especially harmful to the fabric of Canadian society or especially irreversible?
I think it would be, it's a general, there is, when I get to the conclusion, I'm trying to sort of, and you mentioned the chapters that touches on real estate, on affordability, We've gone way harder on a lot of gender ID issues than even the United States. We've gone way harder on a lot of sort of, so-called anti-racism, this sort of oppression versus oppressed versus oppressor dynamic. We've gone harder on that than the United States. In terms of any particular issue, I think I would just point to sort of a unifying problem across all of these 8 chapters. Is just the fact that Canadians don't understand what's going on, or I think why these problems were able to get so bad so quickly is because of this sort of generalized Canadian sense that there are certain things that do not happen in Canada, that we are a well-run country, we do not have corruption, we do not have bad actors, we can set policy in place, and generally good people will, and we're different from any other countries. We do not have, ethnic tensions. We do not have we do not pursue bad ideas which immediately go off the rails and hurt people. And I think it's that just generalized sense that comes up a lot. And I mean, there's sources I quote in the book, foreigners, who say they'll do work in Canada and they're sort of surprised how strong it is, even as compared to, pick your average wussy European country that usually gets compared to us. And so if I was to pick one problem that sort of unifies all this, and I think is at the root of many of Canada's policy problems, it's that idea. And I've even seen that in sort of the response to this book. I'm a Canadian patriot. I plan to have my ashes scattered here. Just writing a book saying, by the way, this country that you love, I should mention that there are some things we're doing very badly, and the country would be better off if we stopped doing these bad things. Some corners of Canada will say just the very fact that you're writing a book criticizing the country is unpatriotic, and this horrible, Russian-funded man should be silenced. So that would be my answer to your question. This sort of somewhat unique capacity for Canadians to believe that there are things that do not happen in Canada under any circumstances, and ironically, because of that belief, there are now things that only happen in Canada because we weren't prepared for them. We had no immunity for them.
Early on in the book, you say, there is a lot of human tragedy in the coming pages, whole generations robbed of potential, scores of preventable deaths, and untold numbers of innocent people caught within the wheels of a terrifying Kafkaesque bureaucracy. But I'm not going to pretend that Canada's descent into madness isn't simultaneously one of the most darkly comic things a country has ever done to itself. Nobody will fault you if you laugh. In your mind, what is the most tragicomic part of the book?
Oh, that would be, well, it's sort of probably a tie. With the shop teacher showing up with the giant, oversized sort of fetish breasts, and then the school board sort of defending him. And then after a year, he says, "Oh, actually, I'm a man again." And we still don't know, why the motives of that individual. It seems very much like a troll that sort of got out of control. And so that's probably the one people are most familiar with. But I'd have to say, if you're just putting together an Armando Iannucci sort of show about something darkly comic about Canada, it would have to be the one where Justin Trudeau says that Canada is guilty of an ongoing genocide. So it's the only time in history where you actually have a world leader standing up and saying, "Oh, this report says I'm guilty of an ongoing genocide." And when I linked to it's in the endnotes of the book, when he announced that, this was at a women's conference, and he said, "Canada is guilty of an ongoing genocide." I'm paraphrasing, and maybe it's not the exact quote, but this was greeted with 11 to 15 seconds of applause. So that's very surreal, that the fact that you would have a government announcing, "Oh, by the way, I'm a genocidaire." That's never happened before. And for that to be greeted with cheers and applause. And all of the generalized fallout from that, from people saying, "Okay, you've said you are actually a genocidal government. Are you going to change anything about that?" And then, this just kept coming up. So the fact that they haven't renounced that. We are still technically, according to the government of Canada, actively committing a genocide. We haven't done anything about that. There's been no follow-up. We just declared it and then hoped it would go away.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact term, but it was something like self-indictment that you used to describe the way that Canada's leaders have been.
I don't think I used as big of a word, and I didn't. What's the one you used at the beginning of this interview? chastisement or something. There was another big word I also didn't use. Castigatory. Yes, I didn't use castigatory. I wish I'd used that now.
In a previous conversation in early April, I asked what explains the consistent re-election of the Liberals, despite the very obvious signs of decline over the past decade that you reference. I believe I asked something to the effect of, why has the incumbent government been successful in their re-election attempts 3 times in a row, if all of these things are happening? And to that question, you gave what I found to be a very measured response, acknowledging that people have different priorities, voting considerations. In the days since, you've been quite direct online, conveying a sentiment that I suspect is common in conservative circles in Canada. I can read a couple tweets that I thought were different.
If you want, well, I could sort of distill how I would describe it. I mean, I would just look at the voting patterns. So
they're poetic. I don't mind reading them.
Oh, sure, yeah, but you can get to them. But please, all right, read away.
We're not allowed to just run giant headlines reading Canadians are imbeciles. So we're all trying to figure out more nuanced explanations for what happened. Another one was, I'd probably be more sanguine about the future if I knew more Carney voters who had even a slightly realistic grasp of the state of their own country, which I think sort of reflects what you've been saying.
Which I remember, I've covered any number of sort of Green Party runs, and then after, the Green Party, they always lose. That's their job. And then at the end of it, they always react like, people are stupid. That's why they didn't vote for them. And I used to think I was so smug. Those stupid Green parties, they should adapt to the people. And here I am, I'm just, also blaming the electorate for what happened. So yeah, you could see it as cynical or bitter, but I would just point to the voting patterns in that most recent election, in which you had, because leading up to, before the Trump threats were on the horizon, I was sort of thinking, Canadians have realized, and the polls still show they realize a lot of the problems in this book are a problem when you bring it up to them directly. When you say, the Maid system is out of control, or, we obviously, it's bad that we have such waiting times on healthcare access. It's bad that we've instilled anti-racism so deeply within the government that we're actually now advertising for government jobs, based on race. You need not apply if you are not of, these particular identity groups. So all of these specifics, if I get the average Canadian in a room and bring it up with them, they can't believe it's happening and they object to it. And all the polls are in this particular book. I think it was a post-media poll where we asked Canadians, just generalized, do you think immigrants to Canada should adopt, sort of shared values? Now, if you asked the bureaucracy or the Liberal governments, they would kind of get nervous about this question. We found it's very uncontroversial among Canadians, particularly among recent immigrants. They're saying, of course, if you come to Canada, you have to become a Canadian, keep parts of your culture, but abandon those parts of the culture that don't work within a Canadian context. So where I was going with this is, I still think those Canadians are there and they understand these are a problem. But when it came time to an election, we had 44% of the electorate decide that, sticking it to Trump took priority over all these other issues. And you saw sort of a divide that I don't think has existed, at least within living memory, within the Canadian electorate, in which you saw unconventional groups of people going for the Conservatives. Not necessarily because they were conservative, but because it was the anti-incumbent party. Just take us back to where it was 10 years ago. All of the changes, I do not like them. I would like to live in 2015 again, before this government took power. And you saw young people voting for the Conservatives at outsized rates. You saw immigrants voting for the Conservatives at outsized rates. And the argument as to why this is happening is because those groups are more exposed to the problems that have taken place within the last 10 years. So I would point to, similar to when I mentioned about the unifying factor in all the issues brought up in my book, is there is a substantial portion of Canadians who are insulated from many of these massive problems, who, to them, you can show them any number of charts showing that waiting times at hospitals have gotten worse. Housing has become more affordable. This has become more expensive. We now have jihadist rallies in downtowns. if you bought your house in 2004 and you already have a family doctor because it's the same doctor you've had since the 1990s, if you don't have to go downtown, if you have an inflation-adjusted pension, you can live in a Canada in which you do not see those things. You haven't ridden a bus since the 1980s. You haven't inhaled crack smoke or meth smoke. You haven't had to walk through a neighborhood that has gotten increasingly unsafe. You don't go to the neighborhood parks. You don't notice that it's a tent city now. So I think, the divide that sort of showed up in the election is the group of Canadians who are forced to confront reality, and the group of Canadians who are potentially more insulated from reality. So I don't know how you square that. I don't know how you can take millions of people and sort of tell them, no, there's a serious problem and we need to deal with these, right now, sooner rather than later, and just to be met with, these things seem fine to me. I think you're actually making it up. So that was my generalized takeaway, aside from just calling everybody imbeciles, which maybe isn't the best way to... People said it's not a great way to sway voters. I agree, which is why I'm not a politician. I'm writing books called Don't Be Canada.
Right. I'd like to return to the book for my final question. When authors pen an expansive social critique like this, they will sometimes temper their writing with a rosy preamble or optimistic conclusion, something to the effect of, in spite of all the dysfunction, it's really not so bad. Your conclusion is titled, "And the economy sucks." And I appreciate why that section was necessary, but I wonder if there are attributes of the Canadian state that make you optimistic about the future.
Oh, yeah, very much so. So I've been telling people, when they approach me about the book or when they say they're buying a book, I say, yeah, it actually is. Ideally, you should get to the end of it and be optimistic, because I think unique among almost any other country on earth, all of our problems are made by ourselves. So you just think of it, like a family member or, your own personal problems in your life. The moment that you realize that every bad thing that ever happened to you, you're the architect of that. That's great, because that means you can fix them. You don't have to deal with an external force. You're not sort of held in. So I think, yes, you can get to this at the end of this book and realize, high crime is a choice. Housing unaffordability is a choice. Low economic growth is a choice. These are all things we didn't have to do. We decided to do them anyway, and here's the reasons why we did those particular things. So I still think, I'm still very, very happy to be a Canadian, because if you look at any number of countries that face, a uniquely hostile neighbor, and I'm not talking about, someone who just tweets about annexing you. If you're Ukraine or you're Taiwan, or you're dealing with, major environmental problems, desertification, more damaging wildfires than perhaps what Canada is used to. So you just look at any of the other countries that show up when we go to these, big G20 gatherings, the problems they have to deal with demographically, culturally, socially, environmentally. Canada is still a giant pile of resources filled with people, and we're generally insulated from disruptive demographic waves. I mean, we have more control over our immigration system than almost any other country on earth. So we have so many things still to our credit, still to our advantage. So anybody just looking at the raw fundamentals, we are still a country that can run on easy mode. All we have to do is stop punching ourselves directly in the nuts or ovaries, whichever is your preference. So I think, and I have heard this, once you get to the end, getting the diagnosis of what's wrong with Canada, it's sort of like you've had explosive diarrhea for 10 years. You don't know what the problem is. And then eventually you do get a diagnosis. It's bad news. You have a condition bad enough that you have explosive diarrhea. But the fact that you have that diagnosis, the healing can begin. So if you've known anybody with a chronic illness, as soon as they get that word on what's wrong with them, that's the greatest day of their life. And that's the hinge point from when things start to get better.
Mr. Hopper, I will leave it there. Don't Be Canada is out now wherever books are sold, I believe.
Yes, online, Amazon, through Indigo, and directly from the publisher Sutherland House Books. And the sooner I can get working on an audiobook, there will also be an audiobook. I apparently have a lot of blind fans, because they don't have
Okay.
to look at me. So
Interesting.
so
Well,
that's on its way, visually impaired fans.
Very inclusive. I appreciate that. I appreciate you joining me, and we'll speak again sometime.
Thank you, Mr. Forster.